So I think I'm here because Mike is punishing me. Because I told him I really wasn't interested in style. So it was, I mean, everything has style, and we know that any human expression, artistic expression, anything architectural or design expression has a style. And we like to kind of categorize them into these uber styles that we then kind of put ourselves into. But to me, style is not a discussion. Style is, we need to go beyond that. But, and we need to talk, when we talk about excellence in architecture, we need to talk about much more than the style, although when the style is an organic representation of the larger ideas within that building, then it becomes really meaningful to me, and I'm sure it does to you. So this morning, especially in the two churches, it was incredibly graphic for me how those two styles, the sort of Saarinen, Frank Lloyd Wrightian style, and the kind of the Weiss kind of Midwestern farm sort of manor house church style were really, really expressions of their locations, of their place, of their congregation, of the spirituality of the place. So I found them really touching, but I wasn't thinking about their style.
Style is not a word that I think I've used consciously in many, many years. And certainly in the work that we do. It's not working? No, it's working. Hold it up closer. Is that better? Yeah. Oh, I got to, okay. All right. So in the discussions, we have a lot of discussions in the office and discussions with my colleagues. Again, the issue of style, I wouldn't say it's not important, but it's something that is set aside to so many other conditions and complexities that we have incorporated into our design process. And if anything, I think I would expect that most of you find this true, that if you have a practice in which you're dedicated to investigating the nature of architecture from a variety of different perspectives, economic, social, sustainability, for example, technical, and also that you're interested in finding better ways of collaborating and working together with all the various constituents that go into the project. There isn't a lot of room for style. I mean, if anything, the style, let's say, would be the imprint, my imprint, I guess, to blend all those pieces together. But as an overall coherent stylistic trend, we consciously avoid that. Our mantra is to set aside any kind of prejudicial, and I mean that preconception of what the building should be until a long process, rigorous process of research and debate and experimentation.
Yeah. Can I throw in some word, at the risk of being rude? I think what Kevin says is certainly true. But within an office, you all know what you're striving for. But then, as we've been kind of asked to decide what is design excellence, then that implies looking out over the broad spectrum of everybody's work and trying to judge excellence. And it seemed to me just quickly that modernism. Well, I'll let Nancy talk.
Thanks, but I'm not sure how much I could add to what's been said, except that maybe style is what intuition brings to the design process. And would you really look at the two churches, the two modernist churches that we looked at this morning, and say they're the same style? And the style seems to me to be a term that we apply retroactively to work. We can look back and say this is postmodern, or this is modern, or this is Art Nouveau. But when you're actually doing the work, as we're all doing the work, Kevin's right, we're not thinking about style, we're thinking about answering the questions at hand, but what we bring to it in terms of our own methods of investigation, our own experiences, are what makes my work different from Kevin's and different from any of yours. I mean, we all bring something to the table. Otherwise, a machine could do what we do, or we could write an algorithm to do it. Oh, well, yes, well, or we could write an algorithm to do what we do. We bring something to the table. We bring something to the table, and maybe that person, that the fact that there are human beings doing this is what results in style. But to me, when you're looking at design excellence as a whole, I think to look at it in terms of style is a little nuts, because I think what we're looking at is how well our problems solve, but also where each of us has a different sense of humor, a different sense of delight, but it doesn't mean we can't all appreciate each other's. I mean, to me, the more dangerous parts of style, as far as I can see for what's going on now, are where things start looking sustainable, where sustainability becomes a style that's applied rather than a function. And to me, that's the most dangerous stylistic trap that I can see, that I could see on the horizon or here.
Yeah, it's the subject came up about the two churches, and we were kind of agreeing here that, yeah, they were both modern, but there were very different attitudes. There was something, comparing them to other modern buildings we've seen, there was something expressionistic about the Baptist church, I thought, which was a kind of something that was more or less banned in the international style. I was thinking, modernism, I would say that style represents aesthetic preferences. If you say that you have to, it's very good to, it's necessary to express structure, and you are not, you have to avoid intrinsic ornament, then those are two of the key elements of modernism, at least in the international style sense of modernism. We had ornament, for instance, in the first Christian church. It was dying away. It was in subtle relief, but there was some ornament. Susan, please.
So I find this discussion really boring. Okay. I mean, I think we all do. I think we all do, because I think you're all trying to, you're working on something much more sophisticated than something that pleases or expresses a style. I think that the questions are much bigger than that. I think that's why Mike is pushing us toward this, because I think those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, is if anybody today sets out to create a style, they probably shouldn't be practicing architecture, because it's a real problem with that. It's like I'm going to show what this looks like, and they're not addressing the bigger problem. And the big problems, and I hate to say this, the program, and that's a very big word, but and a very complex word. But I really do feel that there's much more at stake than just sort of putting something out there to fit into a stylistic canon. And Mike was having a question up there. I want to kill that original purpose.
Great people there, but in my travels towards this event, architects run from the word style as fast as they possibly can. I have never talked to an architect who doesn't say, I don't do no style, I don't got no, style, that's crap, forget that, okay? And yet, we are in a modernist, what is it, this modernist, it's not called an architecture museum, it's called a modernist museum. We have the building across the street, which, because its style isn't quite current, is not even a piece of architecture.
I don't think that's the reason why that's not architecture.
Well, you can do it. But I want, why do you deny, and why is it so important
Mike, there was an earlier exchange which Susan said, I think something, correct me if I'm wrong, you said something, style is the result or the product. And I don't think, very rarely, there have been occasions in history when somebody has set out to establish a style, but that's not very common. Usually they do what they think is right, and it comes to be recognized at some point as a style because it differs from what preceded and what followed. So it's not something you start out intending to do.
You're saying it's almost an editorial kind of way. Sorry, thanks. Yeah, it's almost a way of editorializing a whole set of circumstances and make it somewhat more intelligible by identifying similarity, right? So I'm going to, I think a more relevant term, at least for my generation, is identity. I think that's something we do work on in terms of making sure that the projects we do have their own identity, express the identity of the people using it and the clients. That may be the closest that I get to consciously thinking about style. But I don't find it a very useful exercise to think about while you're making architecture. I don't particularly find it useful exercise to think about architecture, but maybe, it's necessary so that people who don't have the same background or same kind of training can access architecture. But I think it has a lot of pitfalls in that regard.
Kevin, was it the contractor who caused the beam to come over and not fall on the bearing wall at the entry?
Mike is talking about this building.
The contractor, the beam and the bearing wall, yeah.
And so the question is, if you're not about style and if it's all about the client, then what is that detail about?
I would say everything in this project is a reiteration of going from various scales and determining the kind of inner logic of this particular building. So it's not something, let me put it this way, it would be stylistic in that every Kevin Kennon building ever done, there would be a flying beam that doesn't meet a bearing wall. You could argue, well, that's his thing. But I wouldn't call that a question of style. I would call that either a mistake, which I hope it wasn't, or rather that it was an intentional, it was either intentional in the sense that we went out and it said this was something we really wanted to do, or a lot of times, which happens, is that it's part of the discovery process. It's maybe even a mistake, but we ended up thinking about it and thinking that that was the right thing to do at the time.
I want Nancy, perhaps Nancy could talk about instances of deliberately adopting or referring to. But maybe you don't want to talk about that. You want to talk.
Well, I have sort of lost what I was going to say, but I think that, to me, to get back to Mike's question about what makes some buildings we call architecture and some buildings we just call buildings, was that your question, Mike? I mean, why we call some things architecture and some things that we build we don't think of as architecture? Was that your question? And to me, the difference is not only intention, but also a lot of the buildings that we see in urban and suburban landscapes and rural landscapes too, are not designed for the particularities of a situation. Are designed, or they're either mass produced or they grow out of something other than looking at the program, the site, the particularities of the place. And I think that those maybe are the things that, if we're struggling toward a definition of architecture, that maybe it's the attention to the specifics, to the particulars of a given situation in a place and taking all those things and weaving them into something in a creative act. Maybe that's what makes it architecture. I'm not sure.
I'd like to inject the concept of materials here, because I think that where we have seen things in Columbus that we don't see cheek by jowl in many other places, and I think it awakened in me something that has been hidden for quite a while, is that when the sort of modernist group, the New York Five, was established, they were all of the same class, called by the same God who called them that, and so it became a really specific thing to be doing in a specific way with specific materials. So you have this glass, steel, concrete, and rarely brick, and rarely any other additions to it. And so then we see Saarinen here, which is really a revelation, and why he wasn't picked and anointed as one of the chosen ones. And you begin to see it right here, because he's able to do the modernist style beautifully, and yet tolerate, in fact, not tolerate, but invite Gerard to decorate it up for him. So he's not tossing out everything and making the decorative statement. He's able to do the arts and crafts Frank Lloyd Wrightian style, because he's not only comfortable inventing the way to address that particular problem with all the ammunition that he has, including materials, including craftsmanship, including technology, including all of those things that he uses. And so, it just feels to me like the material has a lot to do with it, the craftsmanship has a lot to do with it, and I think because there's such a proliferation of those glass and steel and concrete buildings, because that has been adapted as the cheapest way of building, what corporations preferred, not certainly what the people preferred. I mean, that's been an imposed style on most cultures, this international style that has developed. That was a question of industrial materials being available to architects, and a technology being available to architects. So in that sense, that's what defined this overwhelmingly oppressive style that you're all working in right now.
Or maybe to get back to what John was asking me in the first place, I mean, maybe one way of thinking about what style is to start thinking about what Jane was talking about this morning, what Dan talked about, is when you go back to a building and you're altering it, what are you seeing and what are you reacting to? And Jane talked very eloquently about the buildings that, the schools that how she reacted to the design of the schools, and how much of the style you really don't understand until you sort of go back and sort of have to have and sort of engage in a dialogue with it, and maybe that's when you really discover what style is. But I don't think it's about materials either. I mean, partly because materials don't guarantee anything. They don't guarantee it's, all they're saying is what the building's made of. It's not how they're used.
Well, I completely disagree with that. I mean, you look at the world, how the world has changed because architects were able to use glass and steel and concrete in a very liberal way, and they remade the world into these glass box enclosures, sealed human beings inside of it, and told us that we were going to get this great view of nature outside of this refrigerator coffin that we were all living in. So I think there's a real problem here, because the materials do define that architecture, and the materials did define the arts and crafts movement. If we don't accept materials as being part of style, I mean, look at clothing. Yes. Let's just take the basics. I mean, if somebody's wearing, Gucci or whatever, Prada, it's the best materials. The best materials define that person's style.
But I don't think that's what I said, because I wasn't I'm not, it's, maybe a lack of eloquence on my part, but I wasn't saying that materials don't matter. I'm saying that materials alone don't define style, that it's not, and that really when you think about the glass boxes that you're talking about, are you going to put Saarinen's Bank in that, in that group of, sort of, I didn't find that sterile at all. I didn't find that a glass box I wouldn't want to be in. I found that sort of a really beautiful, eloquent statement of architecture, and a really, I found that actually a very moving building.
No, and obviously, what we saw here of Saarinen's work and others have been stellar. Then there's the sort of the second-tier architect who exercises those liberties with those materials and populate the world with really second-rate buildings, which we're all living in and we're all suffering from.
Susan, the concrete and the steel and the glass were all there in the early 20th century, but there was an obligation for most architects to cover it up with what looked like stone and what was classical and so on. There was an aesthetic decision to expose those materials. Then you had people, challenging that, with Harry Weiss's and Ben Weiss, the North Junior High with its brick arches. So almost as soon as modernism got established well, there were challenges, and I think part of the development of architecture is to come up with a kind of consensus idea among architects, and then what happens, whether it should happen or not, is that people begin to challenge. There was an idea that modern exposure, industrial materials and exposure of structure and so on were inevitable, that you had to do that. And then you began to get buildings like the North Junior High, where somebody says, well, wait a minute, you can still build a brick wall and a brick arch, and they work perfectly well. So these things are not inevitable. The dogma is sort of punctured.
Well, I'm going to digress a little bit here, because I really don't have any more to say about style. Well, the thing that I'm always fascinated about, a question is, now that Columbus, and it's going to relate more to your opening remarks, John, but now that Columbus is 70 years old, or the Columbus that we come to know is 70 years old, there have been at least 2 or 3 generations of people who have grown up here, have lived and gone to school in these various examples, good and bad, of architectural experiments, which a lot of them were, and has it made a real difference in their life? I mean, Carlos, at the end of his talk, expressed that hope, that optimism, that design makes a difference. I would sure that as you've gone on this tour, I can imagine that thought hasn't crossed your mind about what's it like to live in Columbus. How does this affect people, and is it important to what we do to continue to believe that design matters, or rather that maybe we all believe design matters, that's why we're architects, but to what degree does it matter, and to what degree does it actually impact people's lives? And to whom?
The word Mannerism is something I would be interested in getting to too, but before we do that, I just want to say that in response to what Kevin just said, that maybe as architects, maybe we think we're more important than we are, because or we define design excellence as architectural excellence, and they're not synonymous. If one of the things that coming to Columbus taught me is the importance of landscape architect. I am now a huge Dan Kiley fan, because of so much of what, so much of the places that have a lot of character because of the marriage of landscape and architecture. And I think that there are areas of Columbus that could certainly, the urban, they're episodic moments, and sort of the things that tie pieces together are maybe what we should be thinking about.
I'm sorry, Harold. I would like to, you may be confused, we may be confused. What's happened here is that we have an assigned topic, and yet we're also, it's kind of an ongoing discussion, starting for some of us on Thursday and moving on about architecture and Columbus. And it's hard, we can't really narrow down that discussion too much. I wondered if who out there is there someone in the audience who has had enough experience with people, maybe you have, people in Columbus in terms of their, how this legacy has affected them.
This is just a singular experience that happened yesterday, because I've never been here before. But I went to Sears yesterday afternoon to pick something up, and the woman saw my name tag, and she's like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm on an architectural tour. There's a group of about 100 architects. We're looking at the important buildings in the area." And she goes, "Well, you've gone to Greenville Courthouse, haven't you?" I'm like, "No." She said, "It's the only most important building in this entire region, and it's a courthouse fairly similar to the one here that has a tree growing out of the roof of the tower." And that is what she defined as the best building of the region. So I'm guessing there's probably a lot of people that aren't even aware that these are buildings that matter to those of us who've studied architecture and design.
I'm an architect. I moved here 23 years ago from New Haven, lived there for several years. I've lived in the Detroit area, Ann Arbor, upstate New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And since coming here, I made a conscious decision never to leave because this is utopia to me. I like to keep my home a certain way, and if I had some control over my city, I'd do the same thing. And I think everybody that lives here thinks that way. And we all take care of each other. We take care of each other's city and place. And so it's grown. I mean, I feel it. You know,
You are an architect.
and I'm an architect,
Yeah, okay.
but I can tell you the non-architects feel this way too. Jim's lived here all his life too, and he's an architect, and do you feel the same way? Yeah, the same way. So, if you want to know whether Churchill was right, he's dead on, but here, and not necessarily somewhere else. You need to gain control of your cities. The people need to gain control of their cities, not necessarily the architects. But I think a good example has been set here, and it's working.
I just want a personal experience. Thank you. Personal experience I had. I led a tour of Roosevelt Island in New York, in the middle of the East River. Which was a new community, a model community, modern planning. Well, the planning, whatever. The buildings are modern. The planning harks back in ways to tradition, which is, I think, important. But anyway, we went into one of the apartment buildings, and Ashok Bhavnani was with us. He was a partner of John Johansson, and together they had designed this building. And there was a woman in the lobby who asked, who are you? What are these people doing? And she found out he was the architect. She rushed up to him and kissed him, and talked about how wonderful the building was. Now, the things she talked about were partly that the materials were very durable. The building took advantage of views, and it was highly accessible, not just to wheelchairs, but to strollers and whatever. And she ended up saying, the FedEx man loves this building. And I just thought that was, so there was a personal non-architect reaction.
When we came to design this building, and this was, as a community building, was very much a grassroots effort, and so it enabled me to spend a lot of time with members of the community, both young and old. And what I found was, I actually found a number of people saying it didn't really matter to them. It was the fact that Columbus was an architecture, whatever this is. It didn't really matter to them, and there are a lot more things in their lives that were more important. And yet, when it came for them to articulate what they wanted in terms of environments, it was extraordinary. The level the ability to articulate what they wanted. So I think that what the reality is that, you know, if you bop into somebody on the street, you might get a funny answer, but if you engage them a little bit deeper, it really does make a difference. Well, I mean, you know, it's just that it's one of those things where we could start initial discussion about what people's goals were, what they wanted, how they wanted to interact, and in a way they're just saying, look, I want to, you know, I really want my office to be next to Jim's, you know, which is the kind of typical adjacency. I want to be here, I want to be close to the bathroom, I want to be the, you know, the way that most people kind of think. They actually started to think more broadly and talk about it more broadly in terms of how they wanted, in this case, students to interact and the value of that interaction happening in informal ways. So, you know, which is ideas that we were dealing with just in terms of how to make a more advanced educational institution. But so I guess my general sense of it is that as experiment, there have been some failures, as in any kind of experiment, and the people here have absorbed those failures as well as the successes. But there is a great deal of pride here about the fact that this is seen to be, an important place because of architecture. Why this model has never been, you don't see it anywhere else other than Columbus that I can think of. I guess you have some planned communities like Seaside with Roosevelt Island, right? But very, very few. And this one, I think, is in particular because it's managed to balance all the kinds of good things we think about solid Midwest community with this rather unusual commitment to architecture.
I'd like to get back to that, the woman kissing that architect and why. Because I think you were onto something here. I think that when she said the lasting materials, that it was accessible, that the baby carriage could be brought up, it was all about function. It was all about how it works for the person who uses it.
My answer to that would be, I think these were the things the woman could say. There was an enthusiasm that I think went beyond the durability and the function. But she mentioned the view. I said that. This is my wife.
But it's also experiential, and I think what you've begun to list and adding the experiential begins to give us this list of criteria for architectural excellence. What makes it excellent? So you're really starting now to pull out these characteristics that we can add to that list of what are the criteria for excellence.
And it's funny, I'm going to let Jane ask a question in a second, but I also want to just comment that it brought us back to firmness, commodity, and delight. I mean, we've been talking about function, we've been talking, I mean, I think the fact that our building should stand up and be waterproof should not even be questioned. You're talking about function and how things work, but it's the delight that's the elusive part. And Jane's been wanting to ask something.
Jane's right behind.
At the risk of being thrown out of the room, I'd like to say something positive for the idea of thinking about style. I don't think it's all just program. People live in places, and we're a huge nation. And when you travel to Arizona, you see different materials used different ways. You see walls that protect from the sun and areas of glass that open to the north. You see a completely different um, experience of architecture that is beautiful, that is works for its function, works for its place, works for its climate, and it's totally different than the very beautiful Republic building here, which is steel and glass and perfection. I mean, it's beautiful. And it's been operating, and the people living in it, working in it, love it for you know, how many years? You know, lifetimes. And the fact that there are these differences because of place, it allows a current, timely expression of our materials, our time, to happen in different ways. But it's notable. You can tell differences. And to put in, to put the Republic in the desert, you know, might not work so well. And then I think of Lake Flato's work in Texas. And so the whole idea of regional architecture has a validity that comes out of its place, its materials, how they react to the particular climate exposure there, how they protect people, and how the tradition of those people in the, say, recent past in America forms a legacy that moves through the water in those locations. So I'm so excited by being able to work at this time. I have no idea where architecture is going. That's what makes it so exciting to me. But I know that it generates out of the materials that I can use now that couldn't be used 100 years ago, that are being developed as we speak, that we need to help develop. And the fact that you have core principles about the way you work is essential. And if core principles result in differences that are notable, one could almost say there's a style if something is notable. That notable, and you can talk about it. You can talk about the similarities between notables in this water and the similarities between notables in this lake.
And maybe we're just talking about a stylistic, a difference in definition of what style is, because, I mean, I think my argument first was that what we do derives out of the particularities of the circumstance, of the context, of all the things that we're trying to do, which isn't so much different than what you just said. I guess what I'm saying is that style maybe isn't the idea of a style isn't our overt intention. Our intention is to make things out of particular pieces, out of particular materials, out of particular circumstances, and out of these things comes the way and what we bring to it as architects. And out of this comes something that other people can call style, but I don't think any of us sets out when we're sitting down to think sort of consciously, you know, what style is this? And maybe you do, but to me at least, I feel like what I've said isn't that much different from what you've said, but we're calling it very, very different things. I think I'm not calling it style. And it's not,
Or the beginning.
or the beginning,
Yeah.
exactly. It's not the prime mover, and it's not the end in itself.
Yeah, so I think Jane said something really key here, because I think we're beginning to understand more the needs of understanding climate and regions and terrain and vegetation and water and materials within a place. When you bring up Lake Flato, they have understood that place really well and rendered it really well in their buildings. And so you may call that a Texas style or whatever you call it. It doesn't matter. But the reality is that they're expressing something within that area that is organic to that area. And I think my problem has been for many years is that everywhere is the same building. And so, and that could be because corporations love to brand themselves all over the world with the same brand. So they build the same building everywhere. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's just because everybody uses the same materials. Maybe it's this. Maybe we should all blame Philip Johnson for starting the international style and talking about it as a style. I don't know where the blame is, but the reality is that when we started talking about sustainability, I was becoming very hopeful because I thought that now we're going to look at the regional differences, and now we're going to really look at what's here, what's available, what this world is about, and how can we build for this. And I thought this could be like a really interesting moment for architecture. And I'm just beginning to see some of that, and maybe it's going to take a long time. But do we have that long to wait? So I just think it's a really important question that you brought up, the regionalism.
Jump in as moderator. There's still we talked about to an extent about what you were all doing when what the architects are doing when they're designing, what they're thinking. We talked about the public. The question of design excellence is related to what we choose to publish, what we choose to give awards to, or what we choose to come and visit. I mean, we've come to Columbus because we see some kind of excellence. I want to throw out one thing. How much is innovation one of the characteristics that we place a lot of value on, or something being innovative or influential on other things? In a way that has nothing to do with its excellence, and yet we inevitably see that as all the way back to the Renaissance or to Gothic period, whatever. We look at what was most innovative as what was best.
I think you're bringing up a whole nother subject, but which makes this a very interesting conversation. Because it begins to, and to Jane's point, it begins to, not that we quite understand it yet, but it begins to help us understand where we are right now. And I would say innovation is absolutely a key component, at least the work that we do, because we're always striving to try something, even if it fails. And by that I mean fail in the sense of an engineer uses the words failure, or a scientist uses the words failure. That there's a continuum of risk-taking, experimentation, things work, things don't work, but nonetheless you go ahead and you try. And I think without that kind of impetus behind your work, it may be thoughtful, it may be clear, it may be warm and wonderful and understanding, but I don't know if you really engage the difficult questions of culture without attempting to somehow innovate.
So I have a question about that, because there seemed to be a professional reticence toward innovation, as far as I can see. Everybody's afraid to be sued, and it's a real risky thing to do. And unless there's innovation, there's no progress, and there's no real understanding of the next phase of building and next phase of materials. So we seem to be caught in this bind right now, that everybody knows that the materials that you're working with are not functioning according to their what you're trying to push your materials to do. I mean, it's not a secret in this profession. So how, and yet everybody, including the manufacturers, is afraid. And the Columbus was built at the time when people weren't afraid. People really were afraid not to innovate, because it was a time when we were flying to the moon. We invented technology. We had NASA. We had, amazing things were happening in this country and around the world. And we had this sort of faith that we can make things. And none of that exists. So how does this question become important again to us? Because I think it's really important to start innovating. So anybody with any answer? We'd like to discuss this at AIA because this is a key issue here.
Innovation
Just
is something that a lot of architectural firms don't have the income or economic ability to do much with, but I think that we are pretty good at looking at other industries and borrowing from other industries. Our three-dimensional software came out of aerospace and aeronautical companies. Somebody yesterday was talking about, I guess Gunnar was talking about high-velocity distribution systems coming out of boat building. There are lots of examples from automotive manufacturers or even fashion where we borrow ideas from other industries. Yeah. And I think it's hard for many firms to do much innovation internally just because of the time pressures of projects, the economic pressures of projects. We don't often have a lot of time to sit and dream of things outside of the work that we're doing.
Innovation doesn't mean you have to develop the technology. I mean, to apply it is innovative. I mean, in terms of architecture, to apply innovation from some other source is innovation in architecture, and it happens over and over.
Isn't the real issue about, as architects, being timely to our culture and place? And timeliness, I think Saarinen is really prolific in his understanding of that, both the elder and the younger. We look at a brick or Kahn or anybody, I mean, what can the ordinary become extraordinary by our reinvention of understanding its potentials in new ways, its craft in new ways? For too long we've used the excuse the craft is dead in America, and it's thriving, it is just itching to be tried and tested. But too often we don't ask those questions of the craftsmen because we're the technocrats that are the leaders that know what we want, know what style we want, and tell them what to do rather than listening to what their tools and their experience brings us to. So I think when we talk about this innovation question, it's about to be innovative with the ordinary, to get new things, to understand what the craft of a place was. One of the great ways to bring placemaking into the game is to really understand the heritage of a culture and a place. And not, once we had the beauty of the old lumber store, the old lumber yard, right? The old brick manufacturing place. We've replaced that by the Lowe's and the Home Depot. And that's not, that's our resources right now, but they have these materials. I'm much more interested not in seeing the newest material to take a risk on, but sort of being timely to this point. And isn't it interesting, at the end of the 19th century, when Louis Sullivan was giving us the high-rise construction, that terracotta became the material and rigor to complement those buildings by weight and efficiency and clad those frames with. As we move into the 21st century, new glass technologies, which are old but new in what we can do, and Fritic glass and these glass skins and their high efficiencies and their coatings and their insulative qualities, they're sort of a new material but an old material in a new way. So I think it's always finding the search for the timely, because no timeless building will ever exist that wasn't timely to its point of making. And that's not such a hard task to try and understand timeliness.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because the way you just described innovation, I think is very different from what I heard the gentleman up there. For me, and I don't know if Susan agrees or not, but for me, innovation is a way of thinking, primarily, and it's a strategy for design. And it doesn't mean that I'm out there building the next B-1 bomber, in terms of sophistication, or I'm curing cancer. It just means that at every part of the process, you engage in a real critical dialogue and ask yourself, what if we use this in a different way? and what I think may be the problem, and I'm going to throw this out there because you said a very good word, progress. And progress, I think at some point, and innovation were closely allied. And at some point they got derailed, where we began to think of progressivism in the same terms that some people use the word liberalism, and progressivism as essentially being a kind of utopian concept where design engineers the world. I'd like to think that we could get back to having now dislodged those two meanings from each other. I'd like to think that we could back to a time and a place now where we can think about progress in a positive way, not in a utopian way, not that we believe that we are social engineers, but that in small ways, the way that you described it, whatever you can do on any project. I'm not buying the argument of time or money. I do think it is a question of commitment to some of the core principles of how you engage architecture.
Along those lines, I mean, to me, it seems that one of the great places for innovation or for moving architecture forward, and it's something that I think is happening in places, is starting to think more holistically about the environment and not leaving architecture, not thinking about architecture solely as building or as building systems. And I think that, to me, that's been the most interesting thing that's happened over, the course of my career, is watching, starting to think about, when I went to school, architects didn't talk to landscape architects, didn't talk to planners, or at least in the school that I was in. And I think that is changing, probably not fast enough. Certainly it was happening. I mean, but it wasn't happening on a regular basis. They were still seen as different disciplines. And I think thinking of planning, not just in terms of, you do one thing at a large scale, another thing at a small scale, but thinking of these things as things that you do simultaneously at a bunch of different scales, I think is one form of moving us forward. But I also want to say that in anything that is innovation or progress, and I use those words kind of a little, I'm not sure exactly what they mean in this context, so I'm using them a little tentatively, that we need to ask our clients to go along with us. I think one of the reasons that Columbus is so interesting was because there were clients, a client who was interested and excited and willing to take the risk. I think we need to make sure that if we're, you use the word failure, if we're going on an adventure, we need to make sure we take our clients with us.
Remember, at the time that you came down here, it was called progressive architecture. We don't have progressive architecture anymore. Well, but think about that. Think about the demise of that title. No. I mean, think about the demise of that title and the progressive nature of that magazine potentially for architecture. And so I think we have to think about that, because words do matter. And I think when we stop using and we start being uncomfortable with words like innovation and progressive and breakthrough and those things that basically are difficult, but they have to be done, then we have to start questioning our methods and our attitudes. So I think we can't just dismiss these things as not being important anymore because we're uncomfortable with them.
Say something about this because I think and I think that you're right that there's a moment at which Bob Venturi had a breakthrough and had to do with complexity and contradiction, but I think it was very hard for Bob Venturi at that point to get work, to be recognized by his peers. I think for a long time he had a sort of an interesting relationship with groups of architects who didn't see his work as excellent, but saw it as heretical. So I think that, it's kind of interesting that maybe some of the breakthrough work is actually happening at the fringes of people who aren't sitting around talking about what design excellence is. Because I think that was a conversation that I think a lot of his peers thought he was that he was nuts and he was upsetting their apple carts. I mean, I think at that time he was seen as a heretic as well as by some, breakthrough.
I have to say it that unhappily that time isn't over. I had to struggle to get you and Daniel and the fire station in the program. It's still there.
That's sad.
Well, I'm not Bob, and Dan's not Bob, so I think that there's a, but as representatives of the firm, I think the idea that the fire station wasn't seen as something is, and again, from the world I come in, that's, I'm actually surprised to hear that the fire station doesn't mean more to sort of the AIA or the group of whoever you were discussing this with, because a number of people have come up to me, a number of architects who were in the room have come up to me and said, oh, tell Bob that really, the fire station, when I came and I saw the fire station, it welcomed me to, welcomed me to Columbus, and it really said something to me. Or it was a real, as a young architect, it really meant something to me. So I'm surprised to hear that you had to struggle to get it on the program. Though I don't think he would be displeased, because I think over time, I think he's come to see the fact that people disagree very strongly about his work as some evidence that there's content there that people could argue about. I mean, when Susan said the other day, someone could ask, why is it in a Butler building? Why are these windows this big? Why is that door that big? The fact that you can ask those questions and that you're asking those questions 40 or 50 years later, I think is evidence that there was content in that. And I think both of those projects are a testament to the fact that architecture doesn't have to do with size or money or or exotic program, that they have to do with making everyday things work really well and express themselves really well. When Bob, because I thought I might be asked at some point to talk about Fire Station number 4, and before I left, I talked to Bob and Denise and sort of asked them. I said, I was 7 when the building was done. I don't know much about it, so give me some more. Give me something to talk about. And and for Bob, it's about this very simple silhouette. It's about sublimation of detail to the whole, but it's also about about the human scale. And we got into a whole discussion about thinking. Maybe it relates to innovation, but in terms of were you thinking specifically about Palazzo, the town square in Italy with the civic station? It came, it's partly intuition and experience sort of brought those things forward, and by looking at particulars. I mean, if you ask Bob, he'll tell you that that building is rigorously functional, and it was something that he brought that also sort of made it not only rigorously functional, but also civic. And his idea of making something that is small and functional, also noble, is how the fire station came to be.
I'd like to ask the panel to maybe spend a couple minutes in talking about what technology and where the future is for design, because in a way this has been a great look back from 40 to 50 years. But these days we have the iPad, we have tremendous materials, we have tremendous sealants, we have tremendous technology. So how do you see a place like Columbus or others setting up a venue and an atmosphere so that 50 years from now we can look back and say this was a milestone in architectural development? We've got things like LED lighting, all those things. I mean, it's a whole new world as we look forward. So I'd like to have you comment about how we're going to capitalize on what's here today and take it into the future.
Can I? Yeah. So there's the example of Saarinen working with GM. We all heard that story, the tech center. and how he worked with the automotive engineers to develop whole new sets of technically sophisticated products, whether it's joinery, whether it's a material, whatever they were working on, he was able to take that automotive technology and translate it to building. I think someone mentioned that up there. And anybody who works with an Apple or a large computing company that does all of this innovation, and as an architect, and doesn't somehow tap into that, is missing a huge opportunity for the tapping into their knowledge, their computer technology, manufacturing technology, the material technology that they have is missing a huge opportunity to translate some of that high technology to the built environment. And I think I'm not seeing a whole lot of that. I mean, I think Saarinen still is probably the only one. Maybe there were others who basically used the ability of the manufacturer to make things, to invent things, to engineer things, and then he did these beautiful details. I mean, you go into that tech center and you marvel at everything. I mean, you really literally just go over it inch by inch to see what else did he do. And I think that in itself, that's a great inspiration. That's a great example for me as somebody who just writes about this stuff. And I would imagine for you who are really interested in doing some very interesting new things to tap into something that is already there. There's a mic here.
And one thing that I would say, one firm, just as an example, and I know this may not be your favorite, although it's one of mine, is Frank Gehry, who has used technology to be able to design and bend materials in creative, expressive ways that took them in a new direction. So there are certain things that can be done, I think, technologically in the construction and the malleability of materials that comes out in a lot of his work. So that has been used today as a new movement.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer your question by touching on the point I made earlier about innovation and risk-taking. In this case, using what we do in our office is we use technology to experiment, to literally run different types of experiments through modeling. And we can quickly, very quickly, model something, look at it, test it, send it to the engineer, have them look at it, test it. And we can do this very efficiently. It's not necessarily what Susan's talking about, which is, I think, is another aspect of this. But I'm talking about something that everybody can do in their office without a lot of, because all of this stuff is available to you. It's just a question of where you put your resources, how you allocate your time, and the incredible ability of the computing power and the internet, frankly, because the internet allows us to research materials, get information, building systems very, very quickly. So it's a wild world out there, but it's a wonderful world of a lot of really great technology that's readily available. I think that used in the right way can continue to make this profession relevant and wonderful.
Can I just add? I'd like to add something to the Gary follow-up here, because just to get his forms, his biggest contribution probably is Gary Technologies, because the software that they developed to create all kinds of new architectural forms is to me, is more important than Gary's buildings themselves, because I think whatever. We have different opinions about this. But I really do feel that it's that kind of ability to, again, adapt software from another industry. I mean, CATIA is not an architectural program. The architectural programs are these metrics that, you know, everybody's using it as measurement, but not necessarily as design. And you need to design the design programs. So, and they were able to integrate design into the program, which is really key to all of this. So I think there's, what we need to really think about, all of us, is levels of innovation, types of thinking that we have to do in order, all of us need to do in order to get the next level of understanding and expertise.
I just want to add that the world is constantly changing, and that our buildings, though, also need to be built to last, and that maybe building flexibility into our buildings is something that we need to continue to think more about. You know, there's you know, the idea of using, I think there are different kinds of ways of making progress. One's progress in design that I think no one could argue with, and then there's also sort of making our buildings overly reliant on today's technology, so that as technology changes, our buildings become obsolete, which is also a little bit crazy. We have to be able to leave a client with a building that they can operate, which at the scale that we work at, which is sort of small to medium scale, we have to make sure that our clients, when we leave them, know how to use their buildings, and also that when they want to renovate their buildings, that they're flexible enough. If it's a use that's going to change over time, that our buildings sort of allow that change.
I'd also like to ask something here, because the presentation of Scott Brown was really interesting to me, because the idea of bringing back buildings and adapting them and changing them and making them work for the next use. And that, to me, that implies also that the architect studies the materials that were therein, the structure, the intent, all of that, understanding all of that, and whatever the reaction or interaction to that building uses, whether it updates the technology of the building as it was built or uses an entirely different technology in the building, somehow relates to that structure. And I think that becomes a very different way of approaching architecture. I mean, I mentioned that to some of these name architects who I will not name at the moment here, but they don't think that that's architecture. I mean, I just think that they say, I mean, look at what Jane has done with those schools, how they updated it, worked the integration and the uniqueness of each. So how is that not architecture? Yet you ask that same question to the stars that are your stars. They're not my stars, they're your stars. And they say you're not doing architecture. So I think we really have to reconsider what we think of as architecture, what we think of the materials that we use, what we think of the existing building stock that it can teach us. I mean, there's so many things that we're ignoring right now because we're just mad dash, into construction and cheaper and better and faster and all of that. So we really need to kind of step back and think about this stuff.
It actually isn't a question, but we're close to the end. And I think Gary is an excellent, I think Gary's story is really very much about style. And what happens is, Gary, there's no doubt in my mind, he was an innovator, blah, 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 blah. I mean, all this stuff is great. And that's his thing, and he can, that's great. But he has spawned a style of architecture that gets repeated and maybe that's why architects run from style, because they know that's kind of how it works.
And I know we're almost out of time, but and this might be something that can carry over till tonight's conversations, which would be great. But I wanted to propose a question to a lot of the people here of what my generation of architects should do about these problems, because you could count the number of people that are my age here on one hand, which isn't a good thing. And My name is Aaron. 25. And that's not a good thing. And I think somewhere between Gunnar's generation and mine, architecture, the innovation was lost. It wasn't lost, but is fading, and the publication is becoming too important. And I'm curious to know how do my friends and I change that? You know, how do you engage the people our age in your office? So if anyone has thoughts on that, I'd love to talk about it more.
I think young people, other people probably have answers too, but I think young people bring a tremendous energy to our office. I think we learn as much from them as we do. It's reciprocal, and it's part of being a collaborative office. But also, implicit in your question is what I think I felt as a young person getting out of school. I think architecture always feels like it's in crisis because we're always moving. So I don't know that we're any more in crisis or that we have any more wisdom to impart to a generation of architects other than to keep looking at the particularities of a situation and responding to needs that you see in a way that doesn't mistake style and fashion, that really thinks about solving issues in a way that brings delight to people. And I think that if you can do that, you've made something wonderful. And I think what I see in your generation, and now I'm feeling really old, what I see in your generation is more of a willingness to say, okay, I'm an architect, but I'm also going to study landscape architecture. Or, you know what, I'm an urban planner, but I'm going to go into business with an architect and a landscape planner. We're going to start thinking between the boundaries, because if we're going to think about a sustainable future, we can't draw distinct lines between things. And I think if I could start all over again and do it again, I think that's one of the things I wish I had more of my education, sort of more cross-disciplinary. And starting to think about sustainability and architecture and delight in a more holistic way, and to thinking about the entire, to think about the built environment as a whole, and stop thinking about architecture as buildings.
But I think the question he asked is key, because I think I go to a lot of architecture offices where they're not using the talent, the young talent appropriately. I mean, you're nodding your head because I know this happens. I mean, I go in, especially the large offices, and they're trying to make these little themselves out of this generation that comes with much more technology knowledge, much more than anybody in the office has. The principals complain that they don't know how to make a wall stand up. Well, maybe they don't, but they really know how to use the technology, and with guidance and direction and help with vision, that energy, that knowledge could be put to use. This, just like Nancy says, the cross-disciplinary intent of your generation is powerful, and I think it's really, really useful to the firms that you can navigate across lines. Your ability to connect, maybe not so much personally. I don't know what you're going to do about that. You don't know how to do face-to-face stuff, but you certainly know how to connect to information and each other across the globe. So how does that benefit the firm? I think there's so many things that you bring to the architecture firms that the older members do not have, and you are going to have to push, because you're going to have to push forward your knowledge, because they're not familiar with what you know. I mean, you grew up with this stuff. My 9-year-old nephew is doing websites. So, it's a different world, and I think you are bringing something very definitely useful, important, and progressive.
But I think it's a good question, and I think in this economy it's really hard to give a young architect this advice. But the advice I would give a young architect is to go and work for people you admire, and not necessarily try to figure out what your values are, what you want to be doing, and then go find people who can teach you that and go work for them, rather than going toward a big firm where you might get a bigger salary, but you're going to be drawing stair sections for the first 3 years of your career, or whatever. That's what we did when we were young architects, if we were with a very, very big corporate firm. But figure out what you want to learn and pursue it, and recognize that not all architecture firms are going to be simpatico. Not all architecture firms are going to give you the kind of education that you're looking for, because your education, I mean, my education's continuing. When I joined our firm, I said, well, I'd either stay for 3 years or I'd stay as long as I kept learning stuff. And I'm still learning stuff, and I'm still there. And your education isn't over. So figure out what you want to educate yourself in, and find ways of doing it. And it'll be through your clients or through the firms you work for, but figure out what you want to do and find people who can help you do it.